This is Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast where we bring Jesus into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
Hey guys, welcome to Sports Spectrum. I am Jason Romano. My email address, jason@sportspectrum.com, jason@sportspectrum.com. And today we are presented by Compassion International, the most trusted child development ministry in the world right now. They are offering up an opportunity for you to team up with them and professional athletes for children in poverty. I'll tell you a little bit more later about how you can do that. But for now, check out the website, compassion.com/teamup, compassion.com/teamup, and let's fight and end poverty for these children today. We're also presented by Water Mission, and we love what Water Mission is about, working to stop the global spread of COVID-19 right now, providing urgently needed safe water, sanitation, and hygiene solutions to refugee settlements and other vulnerable communities. Check them out at watermission.org, watermission.org, and become a part of the great work they are doing. watermission.org. Today on the show, we welcome David Chadwick back to Sports Spectrum. He was actually on back in 2018 around Father's Day with his son Michael to talk about a father-son dynamic of basketball and the Olympics and swimming. And Michael, his son, is trying to make a run at the Olympics in 2021 now in Japan. But David's got his own great story, and he's got a new book out as well. It's called Moving Beyond Anxiety, 12 Practical Strategies to Renew Your Mind. Think about this. Moving beyond anxiety. Have we ever been in a more anxiety-filled time than right now in 2020 with a pandemic, with the racial unrest, and with so much going on, so much division in our country? It's caused a lot of anxiety for so many of us. David did not write this book after the pandemic came out, but man, is it timely as all could be with this new book, Moving Beyond Anxiety. David is actually the pastor currently of Moments of Hope Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's been a pastor for more than 40 years, so he has a ton of wisdom. And he played college basketball back 50 plus years ago under the legendary Dean Smith at the University of North Carolina. He was actually a member of the Final Four team in 1969 and helped the 1971 North Carolina Tar Heels basketball team win the NIT championship. And the NIT back then meant a lot more than it does today. David is the author of 9 books, and he also hosts a weekly talk show on faith and values in Charlotte on WBT. Lots of wisdom here. I mean, I'm looking at the notes that I took as we recorded this interview, and there's a ton of them. So I hope you'll be encouraged by the wisdom, by the heart of David Chadwick, pastor and author, joining us here today on Sports Spectrum. Hi, David. How are you?
Hi, Jason. Doing fine. Thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure being on your show.
Yeah, it's always good to reconnect. And I love the excuse, if you will, of a podcast taping to be able to reconnect, which we're doing right now. Let's start. This book is an interesting topic and title and timing. And the timing of the book is fascinating to me. It could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing for an author because you're releasing a book in the midst of a pandemic that you weren't predicting. It released April of 2020. But it might be in the middle of the most anxiety-filled time that we might ever see in our lifetimes. And certainly you've lived longer than I am, so you can tell me. But the heart behind why you wrote this book, it actually came before COVID-19. Wow. Again, the book is called Moving Beyond Anxiety. Tell us about the book and maybe the heart behind writing it, knowing that you wrote this before everybody kind of has gone into this anxiety-ridden world with a pandemic.
Yeah, actually, it was a year and a half ago. I sat down with my publishers, Harvest House Publishers, and we were trying to figure out the next book I've written, including this one, 9. And what seemed to be a natural subject then, and again, you're talking year and a half plus ago, was anxiety, because then it was the number one negative emotion that adults were dealing with. It was the second major cause for teen suicides. And I have a graduate degree in counseling before I was called into ministry, then went to seminary and had Bible and theology degrees. So they felt like it was a natural marriage between counseling and Bible and theology, to address the subject of anxiety a year and a half ago being one of, if not the major negative emotion people were experiencing. So I said, sure, I can do that. Began the book, turned it in, Jason, probably a year ago. Then we began all the editing process. You get that because you've written books yourself.
Yeah.
And it was released in April. So I can't tell you that I knew the global pandemic was coming, and that's why I wrote the book. I just attribute it to God's sovereignty. He must have known that it would be released now during this time period when, as you said, it is the most anxiety-filled time that we've ever seen. And not only do you have the COVID-19 crisis, but now you throw the race riots on top of it, and it's just like gasoline on an already raging fire.
So what is the premise of the book in the sense of, obviously there's 12 practical strategies to renew your mind, but the idea, knowing what has taken place in the last 4 months, 5 months, whatever it's been since the pandemic and now the racial unrest, tell me about the book being applicable to what we're all going through right now. And maybe, again, it wasn't something that you intentionally planned on, but I'm sure it's a great tool, and I've read through it, and it's a great tool for people who are kind of struggling right now or not quite sure where to go and, where to turn to.
Yeah. Well, Jason, the premise of the book is simply this: you are what you think. I mean, that is a biblical perspective. Paul said in Romans 12:2, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5, take every thought captive unto Christ. So I was trained in my graduate counseling psychology program in what's called cognitive therapy. And it is this: you are what you think. So whatever you put in your mind is causing you you feel, then what you feel is causing you to behave. So if you want to change behavior, you've got to get at what you're thinking. If you just get at what you're feeling, you're never going to really solve the problem. It's like cutting off the weed at ground level, but the roots are still deep within you. So if you want to change anxiety, you've got to change what you're thinking. And I really believe with all of my heart that anxiety in and of itself is not a sin. It's a feeling, it's an emotion. What the sin is unbelief. It is the fact that you really don't trust God with every area in every possible way. And I really believe in the first chapter of the book, and the first strategy that I give people is increase your faith. As you enlarge your faith, as you see God on the throne, as you really believe he's sovereign, and that gets deep into your heart, that starts to affect your emotions, primarily the emotion of anxiety. And biblically, we see over and over again where God says, don't be afraid, I am with you. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I am with you. My rod and staff protect you, Psalm 23. It's just there repeatedly. I think somebody counted up over 300 times. The Bible says, do not fear, for I am with you. So the antidote to anxiety and fear seems to be biblically a belief in the large presence of God in your life. Faith is the antidote to fear.
Yeah, again, that new book is called Moving Beyond Anxiety. It's available now. It released back in April of 2020. One of my favorite parts of the book was when you were talking about the importance of the 3-word prayers. And prayer is something that's been on my heart for the whole year. That was actually my one word in the beginning of the year, was prayer. And I just want my prayer life to be more fruitful, I guess, and deeper in terms of my connection with the Lord. And I know so many that want to have a better prayer life and want to grow in their spiritual journey in terms of prayer. And you made it kind of simple in terms of how you wrote this with just simply 3-word prayers. Can you talk a little bit about the idea of 3-word prayers and kind of expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I can, Jason, and be more than happy to. It's interesting that in the next chapter after faith, I talk about the need to renew your mind through prayer, but it's not just prayer, it's the prayer of faith. That prayer is just a vehicle, in my opinion, that delivers faith to the throne room of God. And what the Lord wants us to increase is our faith, and prayer, again, is a vehicle for using faith as a way to going to God and having anxiety decrease. So what is prayer? Well, prayer is just simple communication with God. And interestingly, the disciples only asked Jesus to teach them one thing. In the 3.5 years where they walked with him, they asked him to teach them one thing, and that was how to pray. They watched his miracles. They saw his peace amidst the growing antagonism of those around him. They saw how he lived life, and they concluded A plus B equals C. His power and his ability to face life was secondly rooted in his prayer life, and that's what caused him to have peace. So they went to him in Matthew 6, for example, and said, Lord, teach us to pray. So similarly, that's what I was asking myself in the book. Okay, we need to deliver prayers of faith to the throne room of grace. How do we do that in a way that doesn't overly complicate prayer? If prayer is just communication with God, well, how do we communicate with him? And suddenly, Jason, it dawned on me, if we could come up with a simple strategy for teaching people how to pray better, that would really be helpful. And that's when I came up with the idea of 3-word prayers. Reduce your prayers to 3 simple words. And it really is biblical. If you read the Bible, you see people over and over again prayed 3-word prayers. For example, the father who had the son who was demon possessed came to Jesus and said, help my unbelief. That's a 3-word prayer. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego prayed, we're not going to yield our lives to the prophet of the Babylonians, to the gods of the Babylonians. And then they turn around and said, and if not, if they're not delivered from the fiery furnace, they're still not going to worship the gods of Babylon. So they're just throughout the Bible over and over again. So I encouraged people in the book to write down 3-word prayers. Help me, Lord. Give me strength. I am yours. I surrender all. Or the things you might need. Lord, a better job. Need more money. Whatever it could be. Reduce your prayers to 3 words. A, they're really easy to pray. B, they're really easy to remember. And C, you can pray them all day long. You can be in the middle of a board meeting in your company and be under your breath whispering 3-word prayers throughout the entire board meeting. So that way you keep the biblical command, pray without ceasing, ever before you as well. So it's just a simple way to develop faith, a simple way to pray. And I think it gets great answers as well.
I love that. Yeah, the 3-word prayer. Check out a book. Again, and it's in the book, Moving Beyond Anxiety. David Chadwick is our guest today on Sports Spectrum. One of the chapters in your book talks about having good teammates. And basketball is obviously a large part of your life, especially early in your journey, having played for Dean Smith at North Carolina. We'll share a few Dean Smith, North Carolina stories in a little bit. But I have to imagine having that basketball background and the sports background. Your son is hoping to be in the Olympics next year as well. We had him on last year, Michael, on 2 years ago, on Sports Spectrum's podcast. So sports is ingrained in your lexicon, if you will, of your life. I have to imagine that gave you a blueprint on the importance for all of us to have great teammates, right?
Jason, I believe with all my heart, and you know this too, with your love of sports and having played it, that sports is just a microcosm of the macrocosm of life. And I think one of the beauties of sports, and for parents to get their kids involved in sports, is they learn how to work with other people in order to succeed. And that's what life's all about as well. So one of the chapters in the book talks about if you want to reduce anxiety in your life and feed your brain positive thoughts, look around you at your teammates. And if you have teammates in life, those who are closest to you, constantly feeding your brain with negative thoughts, with this is impossible, you can't do this, look at all the problems, those kind of things, you just got to get to the point where you say, I'm going to still love you, but I'm not going to let you speak into my life. Or even better, maybe get new teammates. My daddy used to say all the time, friends are like elevators. They'll either take you up or they'll take you down.
Wow.
And if we are having friends, teammates around us who are constantly bringing us down, we need to find new teammates. You know this, on a team, one bad apple can spoil the whole bunch. And if you have bad chemistry on a team, and one person can cause that bad chemistry, coaches realize no matter how great that player may be, and you can think of different ones through the ages, the coach will get rid of them for the sake of the team. And that is one thing that Coach Smith would always say, is the team's more important than the individual. You've just got to have good people around you who are feeding your mind faith, hope, and life, and not despair, disappointment, and discouragement.
We'll get back to our conversation with David Chadwick in just a little bit, but want to tell you some more about our friends at Water Mission. And man, they do amazing work, a nonprofit Christian engineering ministry that helps fight the global water crisis with safe water, sanitation, and hygiene solutions in developing countries and disaster areas. And right now they're working to stop the global spread of COVID-19. And these are areas that are vulnerable, communities that are vulnerable, these refugee settlements. And again, they do amazing work. And think about some of these numbers. 2.1 billion people lack access to safe water. One person dies every 37 seconds around the world from water-related illnesses. Seems so kind of shocking, I think, for me when I think about where I am. And I've never had to worry about clean water in my life. But there are people across the world who are literally worrying about where they're going to get clean water from. And that's why Water Mission is so important, building safe water solutions that break through the global water crisis. Check them out at watermission.org to get involved, to learn more, and to pray for them. Fight the global water crisis with watermission.org. We're also presented today by Compassion International, the most trusted child development ministry in the world. And they're doing an amazing work right now, teaming up with professional athletes because COVID-19 has left nearly 70,000 children without a sponsor. And that is a very, very dangerous situation for so many of these kids that are waiting to be released from poverty. And that's the capacity, these 70,000 children, of an average NFL stadium. So team up with pro athletes right now. That's what's happening. Compassion and some of our pro athlete friends have teamed up to respond to this challenge and help fill the stadium. You can make a donation right now and join that to help fill the stadium. Every donation helps towards a year of needed funding. Check out compassion.com/teamup. Compassion.com/teamup, and let's release children from poverty today. Now back to our conversation with David Chadwick, author and pastor, joining us here today on Sports Spectrum. I want to go back a little bit, and this is probably more of a history lesson for me, just being curious, but I think our listeners will really like hearing some stories here. Back to the 1960s. It was a time of unrest in our country then, as it is now. So what stands out for you when you think back to those times as not only a college student, but a college basketball player attending North Carolina over in Chapel Hill?
Well, when Coach Smith was recruiting me, they were getting good, but they weren't nearly as Hall of Fame-ish, if you will, as the years went by. He had just recruited a really great class that included guys like Rusty Clark, Bill Bunning, Dick Grubar, and you could tell they were going to be really good, especially when you added in the guy from the year before, Larry Miller, who was a first-team All-American as well. And then Larry graduated, and they brought in a 6'6" jumping jack from Harlem, who was at Laurinburg Prep here in North Carolina by the name of Charlie Scott. Mm-hmm. And Charlie was the very first African American in athletics at the University of North Carolina. So I was a year behind Charlie when I came in, and the first of their Final Four runs was 68, my freshman year, and freshmen were ineligible when I was there. That was something Coach Smith believed to his dying day, that freshmen should be ineligible. They should play a freshman schedule. They should become first academicians, then athletes. Yeah. He believed that so fervently because, again, he believed it was student athlete, not vice versa. But obviously the game had become so successful and with so much money involved, that was never going to happen. But in my years, it kind of shows how old I am. Freshmen were ineligible. Then the 69 team, when I joined it, went to the Final Four, and they were really, really good. During those years, I remember Coach Smith getting so much better and better in the eyes of the public. Most people thought he was just an average coach who could recruit good players. But our 71 team was one that changed everything. Charlie graduated, and the 1970 team was the only team that did not win 20 games. We won 18 in Coach Smith's entire history from 66 until he finally resigned. So wow. The pundits thought we were going to be terrible. And we came back and just bought his system. All the guys there just bought his system. Nobody averaged more than 12 points a game. It was 5 guys who averaged from 8 points to 12 points. And somebody just picked each other up. We finished in the top 10. We won the NIT championship postseason, which during those years, it was still a very prestigious postseason championship. And people then began to say, you know what, I think this Dean Smith guy knows how to coach too. And then he continued to get great players, and his coaching acumen allowed the teams to succeed so well. But back to your question, in the 1960s, probably what I would remember most in light of what's going on today is how Coach Smith stood in the gap for racial equality. He stood by Charlie and all of the negative racial slurs that were slung at him from the stands during games and afterwards. I can remember playing South Carolina down in Columbia, and they were a top 5 team at that point. Frank McGuire, who'd won the 57 national championship, was their coach and had recruited a bunch of New Yorkers who were big and strong and athletic, and they were our chief rivals way back then. They left the ACC in 72 over some different issues. But during the game, somebody kept yelling these racial slurs at Charlie, and after the game, we were running out, and that person kept yelling them. Coach Smith took off his coat and started running up into the stands to go get him. Wow. We held him back, and he just was so mad that anybody would yell that kind of stuff at a person he believed, because of his deep religious convictions, was a person created in the image of God. And, you know, Jason, that's just one illustration of so many we saw Coach Smith doing to stand up for racial equality. In 69, our bus pulled up into a restaurant, and we were getting off, and Coach Smith put us all back on and said, they're asking Charlie to go back to the back door to get his meal and eat there. They want to let him in the restaurant. He said, we'll eat at no restaurant that does not treat human beings with that kind of dignity. Just story after story after story of him fighting for racial justice, fighting for racial equality. And all of us caught that who were on the team. We saw it happening. We wanted what he taught us because he was such a man of great integrity. And I can remember in 1968, in my freshman year there, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, 10 major cities in America blew up. You know, it was one of the worst racial tensions in our nation's history. And Coach Smith was in the streets marching for racial justice. And when the Kent State riots happened in 69, people protesting the, I don't know, what was it, 16, 17 students shot in Kent State. You know, students rushed into the streets objecting to the Vietnam War then. And Coach Smith made a strong stand against the Vietnam War. Those were his convictions. And he lived by principle. And I think that's what struck us the most, is he didn't make decisions based on whimsical political fancies. He based his decisions on out and right principles that he felt were given by God that he needed to obey as a human being, as a follower of Jesus. So those are the things I remember most. And he helped integrate North Carolina. He helped integrate the ACC in ways that nobody really remembers today, except those of us who were there on those teams.
That's not that long ago. The fact that you're telling me that you lived through this is 50 years ago, maybe.
Right.
And yet that was a big deal. Like, just having Charlie Scott on that team clearly was a big deal if he's the first African-American to play, I think you said in all of North Carolina sports, but especially for basketball. Can you take me though to your mindset? And I don't know what your background is or growing up, it was a different time then, certainly. And I have even had to, kind of have these introspective thoughts with the Lord to say, hey, search my heart and, create in me a clean heart, as it says in Psalms, because there's biases, I think, racial biases that I had that I didn't think I had, that I didn't even feel like existed. But they were kind of undertones that were there for me in terms of growing up in a very small town, predominantly white. So you're coming into North Carolina, and I have to imagine the backlash from Coach Smith had to exist for a little while there as he fought for that, because that's even 20 years after Jackie Robinson that this is still taking place in North Carolina in basketball with a guy like Charlie Scott. So what was your mindset, and be as honest as you can here about playing with an African-American initially? Did you have any issues with that? And then certainly Dean Smith having that amazing impact for you to kind of see and understand.
Well, Jason, I was raised in the South during the 50s and the 60s. There were separate drinking fountains and restrooms for blacks, or coloreds as they would call them then, and whites.
Yeah.
And, sadly, I just didn't pay much attention to it. I was a preacher's kid. My dad was a very faithful follower of Jesus. He had his own racial stuff that followed him around being brought up in the South. He told me, though, once the story of after he accepted the call into ministry, he went to a big conference of ministers, and he went to his room and entered his roommate, an African-American. Well, Dad's racial stuff swelled within him, and the African-American minister could tell Dad was uncomfortable. So he said to him, you feel some discomfort with me, don't you? And my dad said, in all honesty, I'm sorry, but I do. Yeah. And he said, well, let me do something. Would you mind? And my dad said, sure, that's fine. So he took out a little pen that you use to sew with. And he pricked his finger and squeezed it and said, "What color is my blood?" And my dad said, "Red." And he said, "Would you mind if I took your finger?" And he took my dad's finger and gently pricked it and squeezed it and said, "What color is your blood?" And my dad said, "Red." And he said, "Well, really, aren't we the same color?" And Dad told that story to me on many occasions to show how he, in his own pilgrimage, came to understand that all people are image bearers of God. We're all equal in the sight of God. And that was something that he had to journey through himself. Well, then when he was pastor at First Pres Orlando, Florida, an African-American wanted to join, the very first African-American to become a member of an all-white church. And the elders met afterwards, and the African-American gave his testimony and said he wanted to join. And the richest man in the church, who gave multiple millions, said, "If he joins, I'm leaving." And my dad looked him in the eye and looked at the elders and said, "Well, if he can't join, I'm leaving." And it was a titan power struggle at that moment. Well, the elders chose to follow my dad because they knew that God created all of us equally. And Dad came home and shared that story over lunch. And my mom gulped when she first heard it, thinking, "Oh boy, we're going to have to pack again and move again as a pastor." But it was another, again, brick in my understanding of life that my dad helped form for me, that all people are equal. So I had those experiences when I went to Chapel Hill. I realized that all people are equal. Dad had taught me that. He made that an important part of his life. So when Charlie was on the team, I really didn't think that much about it. I was always remembering what Dad had taught me. But I was surprised by the outright racial discrimination that still existed in people's hearts. Interestingly, one quick story that you might find interesting is the guy who was yelling the racial slurs at Charlie at the University of South Carolina a couple of years ago called me. He found out my number and he said, "Do you remember this event?" And I said, "Well, of course I do. All of us wanted to go up into the stands and get you." He said, "Well, I'm that guy." And he said, "Can you give me Charlie Scott's number?" And I said, "Yeah, you sure can. I sure can." He said, "Well, that's because I have met the Lord Jesus Christ. I have been forgiven of my sins. I know that I was a racist. I think I'm a new person in Christ. The old has passed away and the new has come. And I just want to call Charlie and apologize and ask for his forgiveness."
Wow. What a powerful story. You're still friends with Charlie? I didn't do my research. Is Charlie still with us?
Yes, he's still with us.
Yeah.
It's funny. His hair's a little bit grayer, but man, you run by him, you go, "Charlie, you could still play today." He looks just like he did back in the 60s when he played. And I'm telling you, Jason, he would have been an all NBA player today if he played. His athleticism and giftedness was off the charts, and all of us knew it.
Well, I know Charlie Scott for one reason. It's partially, connected, I guess. It's because of my dad. Now, my dad is a huge Boston Celtics fan. We didn't have the great relationship that father and son should have growing up, but we did have a bond over the Celtics. And I was born in 73, so I don't remember the 76 team that won the title and even those 70s teams of the Celtics, but certainly as a student of the game and sports and probably more than I probably should have been as I grew up, I learned about guys like Charlie Scott and learned about guys like John Havlicek and Paul Silas and those guys who were on those teams with the Celtics in the mid to late 70s. And so I heard a lot about Charlie Scott. Let's just say that from my dad. And he's a fan of his. So I love that we're able to kind of highlight him a little bit and really kind of bring awareness to something that was happening 50 years ago. And unfortunately, there's still unrest and there's protests and there's riots and there's really deep, long discussions. And a lot of people, especially people of faith, are doing some deep dives in their own souls to see what's going on here. So I'm wondering, David, as we wind down and in the midst of the unrest that we're in today, having known and gone through what you've just described, what's been the most important thing for you? And people forget maybe because we haven't talked about it, that you're a pastor, but as a pastor to do during this time of division and racial tension, what's been on your heart?
Well, Jason, I think what I would say is another something that my dad taught me, and that is the heart of the matter is a matter of the heart. That really this racial problem is a matter of the heart. It's called sin in the Bible. I don't think we have a skin problem. I think we have a sin problem.
Yeah.
And really, as I go back to the 60s and can remember these times, I remember in 1963, the different things that were going on racially, the tensions that were there. I remember 65, the Watts race riots, the 67, long, hot summer where every city in America practically erupted in race riots because of the hot summer, but also because of the racial tensions. The 68 Martin Luther King that I have already alluded to, 92 Rodney King. So all of this has been going on. So the heart of the matter is a matter of the heart. I think what's happened with the George Floyd video, that everybody throughout the world, because of social media, had the chance for 8 minutes to watch a police officer unnecessarily and wickedly murder a man.
Yeah.
And he may have been following Minneapolis Police Department rules and regulations, which some people are suggesting now, and they think that it'll be reduced to manslaughter. It still doesn't matter. It was excessive. It was wrong. It was videotaped, and everybody saw it. So I think what happened, it has erupted all of those emotions in the heart that are raw, especially within African Americans, that have never been solved. And here we are 50, 60 years later after Charlie Scott in the 1960s, we still seem to be in the same place. So what I tell people as a pastor when they're asking me, especially folks of a lighter skin color, what can I do? Jason, I just tell them empathy is the pathway to progress. Just first of all, make sure in your contact list you have some number of African Americans who are your friends. Yeah. And if you don't have any there, that's a problem. That shows something right there, that segregation still exists. But if you, as you should, have friends in that contact list, call them up, go sit down with them and ask them this basic question. Tell me some things you've been through that have really hurt your heart being an African American in America. And just listen. And don't try to negate their feelings. Don't try to say you're wrong for what you're feeling, because, in marriage, as you know, if you try to tell your spouse, hey, what you're feeling is wrong, you're going to have a long night of the soul. You may.
It's good wisdom.
Just listen to their feelings. Feelings aren't right or wrong. Feelings just are.
Yeah.
They're being informed by something. So listen to their feelings and just try to put yourself in their skin. Try to empathize. Try to feel what they feel. And then I think that's a huge step forward to beginning to address the structural systemic problems that are going on around us. It's got to be personal first. It's got to deal with the heart. It's got to try to understand what folks have been through. That's the pathway to a better marriage. It's the pathway for better racial relationships as well.
The heart of the matter is the matter of the heart. I got all these notes that I wrote down, David, just listening to you. Such good wisdom there. Thank you again for coming on the show. The new book, again, is called Moving Beyond Anxiety, 12 Practical Strategies to Renew Your Mind. It's available everywhere books are found right now. And David's pastoring the church, Moments of Hope Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. Thank you, sir. This has been great. I really appreciate you coming back on the show, and always good to connect. Thanks a lot.
It's great being with you too, Jason. And here's the book. Notice that it is Moving Beyond Anxiety, and it's Carolina Blue. God bless you, my friend. Thanks for all you do for the Lord.
And many thanks to David Chadwick for joining us here today on Sports Spectrum. He's got such a great story and a great heart, and you can tell that he's been a pastor for 40 years, as the wisdom he has and the encouragement that he has was just wonderful for me to hear personally. I took a lot of notes, and I hope you will as well as you go back and listen to this, maybe even a second or third time. He just had so much to say. And again, his new book, Moving Beyond Anxiety, is available everywhere books are found. David Chadwick is our guest and was our guest here today on Sports Spectrum. We thank David. We also thank our sponsors, Water Mission. Check them out at watermission.org as they fight the global water crisis. And of course, Compassion International. Check them out at compassion.com/teamup and join with pro athletes and Compassion to help release children from poverty. You can also check out our website, sportspectrum.com. That's the home base for all of our content here at the Ministry of Sports Spectrum. A daily devotional. We have every single podcast there, and then articles all day long on the intersection of sports and faith over at sportspectrum.com. Love to have you email me too, jason@sportspectrum.com, just to hear what you think about today's show or any guest ideas you might have, any feedback you might have, jason@sportspectrum.com. And lastly, click that subscribe button on whatever app that you're listening to this podcast on, and that way you never miss an episode of Sports Spectrum. And whether it's Apple or Spotify or iHeartRadio or Google Play or Stitcher, Sports Spectrum's podcast is available everywhere podcasts are found. So thank you again for tuning in. We really do appreciate it, and we'll see you next time right here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.